Good morning, everybody. I'll just let you all get settled down again. Hello, Teresa. Great, good to see you. First of all, how are you all this morning? Are you good, hopefully? I've travelled down from Belfast this morning, which was fine until I got to just outside Dublin, and then I got stuck in a great big snake of traffic, and I was kind of sitting on the van thinking, I wonder if I'm actually going to make this or not, but I did, and I'm here, so I'm really delighted to be here. I want to start by thanking Maurice for inviting me. And I want to say that, in my view, he epitomises one thing that Mark has just been talking about, which is the practitioner in research. Maurice is phenomenal, as you can tell by the book he's written, but he is such a great inspiration for other people in terms of bringing his practice wisdom into the field of academia. So I'm really delighted to be here. I hope to build on Mark Smith's ideas. Actually, we didn't share our talks before we arrived here, but on many levels my talk is quite similar to his, where I'm trying to bring some academic ideas into the practice world of social work and the social work home visit. So that's the focus of my talk today. We've got a new pointer here, so I'm going to try it out and see how we go. So the title of my talk is this: 3 is a crowd, the social worker home visit, competing discourses, and the impact on relationships. And I think that this title encapsulates the difficulties that we face as social workers when we do home visits. In essence, if I were to reduce down the talk, I would be asking myself the question, what matters? What matters within the course of a home visit to a family and the children in that family? I suppose it's a good place to start by just thinking a little bit about what it is that has led me to this particular area of interest. And my background, apart from my academic job, was in social work practice. I was a social worker in a child protection team, doing home visits to children and families. I was then a team manager, and then I was a guardian. I don't know if you know guardians, but they represent children in court. Good, there's a nod, so someone knows what guardians are. So all of that work was heavily involved in child protection and visiting families and children at home. And one of the important things that stems from that is that I think one of the core aspects of practice is around the home visit. And yet, when I stop to think about it, we know so little about what actually happens in those home visits. You, if you're practitioners here, may have reached the stage at some point where you think, is anything I'm doing here making sense, or does any of it make a difference? And that type of question has led to my growing interest in this whole area. So what I want to do is to have a look at the social work home visit. It's a bit like looking at what is residential childcare, what happens, what matters in it. And I'm going to be doing the same with the social worker home visit. I'm going to be looking at some of that word discourse, some of the influences that have shaped the home visit, and that then provide the context within which we're asked to work as social workers. We're going to ask the question, what's going on? And then I'm going to show you some video clips that have been developed from a research project that has taken place across the UK, involving Wales, England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where we've had the privilege of accompanying social workers on their home visits to actually look at what is happening in practice. and to try and capture those invisible elements that make up the core of the social worker home visit. Part of the project has involved working with Viv Cree, who is one of Mark's colleagues in Edinburgh. And part of this presentation is based on a paper that I and she have written together. And it's also based on another paper which is just coming out, which focuses on the research project. So if we think about the social worker home visit, when I'm thinking about training social workers, it's a very taken for granted norm. We do home visits. That's what we do. That's our job. But it's very rare for people to stand back and reflect upon the whole context of the social worker home visit. And this quote here summarises that quite nicely. The home visit is at the heart of social work practice with children and families. It is what children and family social workers do more than any other single activity except for recording. There's an interesting dualism that we'll come back to. And it's through the home visit that assessments are made on a daily basis about risk, protection, and welfare of children. And yet it is, more than any other activity, an example of what Andy Pithouse, has called the invisible trade. It happens behind closed doors, in the most secret, intimate spaces of family life. And then Ferguson, more recently, has argued this. Not nearly enough attention is given to the detail of what social workers actually do, where they do it, and their experience of doing it. In particular, the practice of home visiting, which is the methodology through which most protection of vulnerable adults and child protection goes on, is virtually ignored. And I draw parallels there between some aspects of residential childcare when I'm thinking about Mark's talk, and I'm thinking about the invisible elements to it, the bits that no one captures, the astounding bits of practice that go on. If we look back to the beginnings of the home visit, we can see historically that the home visit has been part of society, part of our ritual, part of our routine, historically and currently. Tracing the home visit back, we can see that it was underpinned by a whole set of kind of spiritual obligations and moral imperatives. Not far back, I suppose, in our history, in UK history, 200 or so years ago, we had a system whereby volunteers became home visitors. Most of those visitors were attached to churches, and the whole practice of home visiting was caught up in the regulation of family functioning, the reform of individuals, and the reinstatement of the self-help principle. And we can see this by the plethora of voluntary organisations that emerged and the types of service that they were offering to families. The focus of the visit was the same. It was to actually assess people's claims for poor relief. And it was to weed out those that were deserving and those that were undeserving. However, ultimately, its aim was the same. It was to build self-reliance. It was to build good character. It was to be underpinned by those kind of Christian, moral, ethical principles. In practice, we saw a great deal of variety about what actually happened. So we had home visitors, some of whom were very uncompromising in their approach. And it's noted in our article that it wasn't uncommon for them to march into homes while occupants were still in bed, demand that they get up, and appeared downstairs for censure or improvement, and refused to leave until they had done so. There was a taken for granted norm that we had access to the family home, and that we could demand and command families in this particular way. There were also people who were underpinned in their practice by a different type of approach, whereby they walked alongside families, often cajoling them, trying to offer support and trying to move them on. At this time, what the home visit did more than anything else was to reinforce the ideas that individuals were the problem. It was you as an individual. It was your fault that you were not coping. It was your fault that you were poor. Being poor was conceived as a sin. And so we had this system whereby, in particular, women, middle-class women, were almost like the instruments of the state going in with the aim of reforming families. It's quite hard for social work as a profession to marry up where it is now in terms of its social justice principles and its history, its foundational stones. It's quite a challenge, really, on some level, given the type of practices that were around at the time. We see how the home visit moved on to become underpinned by social casework, Mary Richmond in particular, whereby we had the application of standardised, systematic social scientific principles during home visits, in contrast to the spiritual ones. And this social casework approach really marks the beginning of a much more scientific, technical, rational approach to the home visit, which has pervaded the home visit right up almost until the current day. We see the application of a social diagnosis model, the collection of evidence about a client, their family and the relevant circumstances, and a composition of evidence from different sources to weigh up and make a plan for intervention to begin change. As Richmond herself wrote, the most successful casework policies are encouragement and stimulation, the fullest participation of the clients in all plans, and the skillful use of repetition. Sometimes there must be warning and discipline. Always there must be direct action of mind on mind. Interestingly, Mary Richmond combined a very scientific, technical, rational approach to intervention in family life with elements of social justice and with a huge interest in training up a workforce to make sure that they were more effective in the home visits that they were carrying out. We then move on to a position where we have a growing state regulation, and you can see the same developments in residential childcare as you can in relation to the social worker home visit. A neoliberal managerialist approach has led to increased bureaucracy, the use of numerous assessment forms that have to be completed, and a focus on the management of risk. All of this is underpinned by a scientific approach, which says that we know the basis of our intervention and that we can effect change. It's a very linear model. The forms in themselves are multi-purpose. They're designed to prescribe our role. They are designed to assist in the gathering of information. They are designed to be an evidence base, and they are designed to be a paper trail. All of those elements of managerialism, accountability, come to the fore. I suppose we have to ask ourselves, what were the background influences to this increased emphasis on bureaucracy that has pervaded the home visit, and that has certainly led to a situation today where social workers feel disconnected from the families that they visit, and whereby the bureaucratic requirements of the job overtake any sense of being able to form relationships with families and children. And one of the things that was happening in the 70s and the 80s in this kind of new political context were the emergence of several child abuse inquiries. These are government-commissioned inquiries, as we know, that take place following the death of children. And in them, the social worker and the home visit are positioned in a particular way. So you'll see here in relation to the death of Maria Colwell that it is claimed as follows. One aspect of Maria's story, which has naturally given rise to concern, is the extent to which social workers directly involved in the case were able to communicate effectively with Maria about her feelings, both during the period of transition and after her return home. It seems to us that this vitally important matter for all social workers responsible for children in care, direct personal communication between social workers and children about their problems is indispensable. It seems strange that given that home visit is a core part of social work activity, that we have an inquiry that determines that communication is indispensable. One would think that we knew that already. However, that is the finding in an inquiry report. We then had several other inquiries, and I could put up a whole list of other quotes, but I came then to Waterhouse in 2000, which was looking at the residential childcare system and some of the failings in it. And one of the things that's said in that particular report is, it is necessary here to stress the importance of the duty of the field social workers to establish and maintain a close relationship with children in residential care and to listen to their worries and complaints. Once a child is admitted into care, the field social worker carries the main responsibility for planning the future. And again, that says two things. One, that we have to have reiterated the importance of that relationship, and two, be reminded about how it's failed. More recently, Peter Connolly. One of the simple and yet understated facts of the case is that it appears that not one professional had a good enough, close enough relationship with Peter to connect with him, to assimilate the signs of abuse and to act decisively on them. Probably that's the first time that the word connection appears, and it's something that we'll return to later on. So there, I've got a couple of diagrams here of some of the assessment tools that we're asked to use. This is the tool in Scotland, Getting It Right for Every Child. It's based on the Unicini model, which is based on a Bronfenbrenner ecological model, which looks at the individual needs of a child, their relationship with their carers, and the wider context. With these particular assessment frameworks come a whole series of forms. There is the same thing, represented slightly differently. I thought I'd put another one on. Now, the issue about those particular forms in the purpose of the home visit is that they dominate the whole content of the visit in terms of what's permissible and what isn't permissible and what the focus of the home visit is. If you feel suffocated by looking at the diagrams, you only need to talk to practitioners to understand how suffocated they feel under the demands of the paperwork that they're being asked to complete. So in terms of state regulation, what's recently happened is the beginnings of an alternative way of thinking. In a recent report by Eileen Monroe, she states that social workers indicate that one reason for the failure to work more closely in partnership with parents and children was because they were encouraged to limit the opportunities to build relationships in case these interfered with their ability to make objective assessments, and in the face of increased bureaucratic requirements, their contact during home visits remained more fleeting. That's quite astonishing. You could look at that theoretically from many different viewpoints and see a combination of different discourses going on within that. It kind of highlights where we are at today in terms of influences that shape the home visit. On the one hand, we've got the demand for increased regulation, what Mark was referring to, evidence-based, what works, prescribed interventions into family life designed to produce outcomes. As social workers, we're being encouraged to engage more and more with this. And in fact, there's a government website in England who are tasked with introducing much more of these evidence-based interventions into the home visit and to provide training and support in so doing. That's one influence currently. On the other hand, we're also in a position at the moment where we're being asked to focus on deregulation. That is, less adherence to the assessment tools and more emphasis on relationship-based practice. That's a slide there that tells you about the government-based initiative on evidence-based interventions. And then the second paragraph down there indicates in what ways we're being asked to engage in relationship-based practice. So if you're a social worker undertaking a home visit, you really will be left thinking, well, which of those matters and how do they fit together? Or do they fit together? Or should something else different be happening? The research project that I have been involved in, it's an ESRC project. It's an ethnographic study. It looks at social workers undertaking their home visits. And our concern is to bring something different into that space by asking ourselves whether social pedagogical principles could or do already actually underpin the social worker visit. It could be the case, for example, that they do underpin the home visit already, but that social workers don't have permission to capture those aspects of their relationships on the forms that they fill in. And you'll see some examples of that in the video clips that follow. What we're going to do is just show you some clips that were made in conjunction with the social workers with whom I did home visits. And these were elements of their practice that they wanted brought to the fore to allow much more discussion and reflection around the elements of what a home visit comprises and what matters within it. So the first clip is what happens before the visit takes place. Hopefully this works. Fingers crossed. It's at the bottom. there's two elements of that clip that are important in terms of thinking about kind of social pedagogical principles. One is, who am I, rather than what I'm doing as a social worker. And this clip here captures social workers going on their home visits where there is a mingling of the personal and the professional. It's a critical part of a home visit, not detailed anywhere, but where there is great opportunity for reflection before the visit takes place. And one of the things that's emerged from the project is the idea of taking that forward through much more of a co-working situation. So we're not focusing on just the individual social worker, but we're focusing on them as connected with their team and with the wider social work community, and connected internally to themselves and what is happening before they go out onto the visit. The other element that we have to deal with in terms of social workers is the context that they work in. And this can be very challenging, and opportunity needs to be provided for reflection on that context. And this is what the next slide shows. So I'll just move it on. Oh, it's the one before, Morris. It's this one. Yeah. The importance of that clip really is to really, I think what the social workers were trying to do was to think critically about the context they're in, and to challenge their own kind of normal practice, if you want, for a different word, within that context. You'll see on that particular slide that there's reference to paramilitary activity, paramilitary connections. This was the research that was carried out in Northern Ireland, where that's still very much a feature of social work practice. They are visiting families where there are paramilitary connections. They are visiting families under paramilitary threat, and it's a very live issue. To some extent become normalised, but actually much further reflection is required on how that then impacts on the actual practice of the home visit. So that very nuanced context has been missing from much of the literature and needs to be returned to, both in what we write and also what we think about with social workers. You would think maybe that, having looked at those first two slides, that social workers don't feel very prepared for their home visits, that they feel overwhelmed by some of the contexts that they work in. And yet, many of the visits that I saw were underpinned by fabulous, connected communication. And that's what the next slide hopefully shows. It's this one here. that's quite a challenging slide for social workers to look at, because on the one hand, within the course of a home visit, they can identify with sort of the elements of that practice as it's going on. But of course, things like rhythm, connectivity, touch, humour, ask yourself whether any of those are in any records anywhere. I think you'll find that the answer is probably no. And I think the same thing probably applies to a residential care setting as well. The norms of what we record, the norms of what we capture, the things that we're, I suppose the things that we're permitted to do. This slide here captures what children talk about. Go ahead. Again, you know, that's not made up. That's a list of things that children were talking about with their social workers in kind of communicative encounters where there was connectivity, there was an alignment, there was an attunement, but much of that too is missing from visible practice. It's not put anywhere, it's not recorded anywhere, it's not evident anywhere. And it's quite a challenge to social workers to bring that into the open space. How do they do that? How do they make their relationships with children at the forefront of what they're doing, and how do they better capture it in some of their practice encounters? One of the things that we're doing in a paper that stems from this is thinking about a different model for social workers in their home visits that allows them to reflect on those things that I've just mentioned. This clip here perhaps symbolises and characterises what some of the things that we do know that whether go wrong in visits, I suppose. So I'll just let you see this. Have I moved that? Yep. that clip there kind of highlights one of the struggles that social workers have in their home visits about what the focus is of the home visit. So just to move this on towards ending, you can see from the clips there that communication and connections, they're multifaceted. There's a complex series of very inextricably linked and intimate interrelations and interactions. We're talking about things like words, facial and hand gestures, body positions, touches, sounds, as well as the use of silence. At the moment where we know that that goes on, it's not actually a feature of any form of discussion or reflection anywhere in social work practice. And I suppose really kind of following on from the earlier talk by Mark, there is a need to think about who I am, not necessarily just what we do, to create more space for reflection and reflexivity, and also to think of models that much better capture some of the excellent practice that goes on. And I do feel, relating this widely to residential childcare, particularly residential childcare in Northern Ireland, where the sector is under enormous pressure politically, and where, unfortunately, many of the examples of wonderful practice get hidden in the side wings while the political debates about what the purpose and function of residential childcare, its cost, its sustainability, actually dominate the agenda. So I hope that talk kind of realigns the home visit, and I would like to see the same thing happening in residential childcare as well. So thank you. That's the end of my talk.